Wonder what would be your reaction if a garage mechanic from Wigan arrived in Trafalgar Square and claimed to be God. Would you be convinced? I have the feeling he'd be put under a social worker at the least, probably recommended to a psychiatrist, and if he was causing a considerable disturbance of the peace, he'd probably be taken into custody. I had a letter a few months back from a man who said this. He lived in the Midlands, and he wrote like this. He said, I bought a tape of yours recently because I thought you were a pop singer. But he said, all that was on the tape was words, and I was bored stiff. But he said, I just wanted to write and let you know that I am the one you were talking about. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. And he spent 14 pages telling me this. What's your reaction to that? Well, 2,000 years ago, a village carpenter from an obscure Mediterranean country actually made that claim. And I want you to realize how difficult it was for people then to be convinced. Yet now, 2,000 years later, 1,500 million people are convinced that that village carpenter was telling the truth, and they now worship him as God. That makes him pretty unusual. And we are going to spend these talks looking at the uniqueness of Christ. Let's begin by looking at something he said less than 24 hours before his body lay cold in the grave. It was the night before he died. He knew he was going to die, and he was comforting his friends. They should have been comforting him, but he was comforting them. And this is what he said. He said, don't let your hearts be troubled. You trust in God, then trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And you know the way to the place where I'm going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And Jesus said, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know the Father as well. And from now on you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe me on the evidence of the miracles themselves. I tell you the truth, anyone who has faith in me will do what I have been doing. He will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. Now that statement in the middle of that little reading, I am the way, the truth, and the life, is about the most offensive statement you could imagine in today's world. It is considered arrogant, bigoted, and totally unacceptable. And in the first two talks, I want to tell you why. To make such a claim today is considered out of the question. Why should it be? It's the little word the. If Jesus had only said, I am a way, a truth, and a life, that would be totally acceptable, and people would consider it. But when he said the way, and the truth, and the life, the modern mind cannot cope with that. Most religions in the world will accept Jesus. That may come as a surprise to you. Judaism accepts him as a great rabbi. There's been a change in the Jewish mind over the last 20 years. There have been altogether 200 books, poems, and booklets written about Jesus by Jews in the last 20 years. They are now claiming him as one of the greatest Jews that ever lived. Muslims accept Jesus as a prophet, as the second greatest prophet, Muhammad being the greatest in their eyes, but they accept him as a prophet. Buddhists accept Jesus as a teacher, one of those who's had insights into life and shared them with us. Hindus accept Jesus as a manifestation of deity, one among many. But if you call him a something, that is acceptable. Call him the something, and that is now totally unacceptable. People will accept Jesus as a superstar, but there are other superstars. Actually, one of the titles of Jesus in the Bible is the bright morning star. Do you know what that means? Have you ever been up early enough to watch the stars go out? And finally, when all the stars have disappeared and the sun is just about to come up and the sky is light, there is always one star low down near the horizon that is still shining. That's the bright morning star. And the Bible claims that when all the other stars have gone, when all the pop stars and film stars have disappeared, there'll be one star still shining, and that will be Jesus. But that is offensive. A superstar, yes, but the bright morning star, no. The way, no. The truth, no. The life, no. Put him among others, yes. Put him by himself, no. Now, our subject is the uniqueness of Christ. There is a sense in which every person is unique, something to do with our genes. There is no one else just like me. Perhaps my wife is very thankful about that. There's no one else just like you. You are unique. Your makeup, your physical makeup, your temperamental makeup makes you special. You are unique. There is only one of you. But that's not what we mean when we say Jesus was unique. Then we also use the word of unusual people. We say he's a unique this, that, or the other. She's a unique this, that, or the other, meaning they are extraordinary, out of the ordinary, unusual. But that's not what we mean when we say Jesus is unique. When we say he is unique, we mean he stands alone. You cannot put him alongside anyone else. You can't compare him with anyone else. He's in a category on his own. He is unlike every other human being. Now let's spell out in what way this concept is so difficult for the modern world. In the 6 talks I want to give, the first 2 will be spent on looking at how people think today and why it is such an offense to them to claim that Jesus is unique. In the next 2 talks, talks 3 and 4, I want to look at the public ministry of Jesus, the 3 years when he was in full view of the public, when they looked at him, listened to him, watched him, talked about him, discussed him, and see just what kind of an impact he made on the people who knew him. And then in the last 2 talks, I will come finally to the 2 facts which make Jesus absolutely unique and different from everyone else who has ever lived. I begin then with the first part of his statement, I am the way. And the word the is an exclusive word. He is saying, I am the only way. Now let's see why that is so offensive. There has been a huge change in our society, especially in Britain in the last 50 years. Years ago, every nation, every state had its own God and its own religion. And when you were born into a nation, you were born into that religion. So if you were born in this country, you were a Muslim. If you were born in that country, you were a Hindu. If you were born in the other country, you were a Buddhist. If you were born in England, you were expected to be a Christian. This was true of most of human history, that every nation had its own religion and its own God. Jeremiah the prophet, speaking to Israel, says, have you ever heard of a nation that changed its God? Yet my people Israel have changed their God. What an extraordinary thing. because the ancient world never heard of a nation changing its religion. And though there might be ethnic minorities living in each nation, every state had its own dominant religion, and national affairs were geared to that religion. That is why, until recently, this country was called a Christian country. And the dominant faith here was Christianity. And our national events, like the coronation and the opening of Parliament, were geared to Christianity. That was the religion of this country. There may have been Jewish minorities or Hindu minorities, but the overall religion was clear. Now that has totally changed. With emigration and immigration, other religions are now on our doorstep. You may find yourself living next to a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. We are faced now with a totally new situation. A friend of mine was ill for some weeks, and because he was a bachelor and looking after himself, his next-door neighbor came in every day with a hot, cooked meal. At the end of his illness, he went next door to thank the neighbor for looking after him so well, and said to his neighbor without thinking, "You know, you've been a really good Christian to me." And the neighbor was furious. He said, "I'm a Muslim. Why did you call me a Christian?" But then the word Christian in England has come to mean for many people a do-gooder, somebody who's kind to grandmother and the cat. And he was just picking that up. But we are now in a missionary situation. Years ago, the Christians of this country sent money and men overseas to persuade people over there to change their religion to what we believed was a superior religion. That was the motivation behind missionary work. And I was brought up to believe that missionary work began south of the Mediterranean. Did you get that impression? Europe was civilized. You had to at least pass Gibraltar before you became a missionary. Missionaries went to the far corners of the world to preach a new religion and persuade people to change. Now the situation has changed. Europe is the mission field of the 90s. I hope you realize that. Europe is opening wide, east and west, to the gospel. Did you know there are more villages in France without the gospel than the whole of the continent of Africa? And many Christians in this country are waking up to the fact that Europe is the mission field we are called to explore in the 90s. Having said that, some Christians are at last beginning to realize that England is a missionary field. And we are faced with a crisis now. We who sent missionaries to other countries to persuade people to change their religion, are we going to do the same thing now that other religions are on our doorstep? Because all of us now are in the position of being a missionary. So we have to face the question, what right have we to say to anyone else, our religion is better than yours? What right have we to persuade them to change their religion? And especially when we discover that many of them are more devout and more pious and more committed in their daily life to their faith than many churchgoers are. So what right have we? When you consider that there are now more Muslims in Britain than practicing Anglicans, you will no longer talk about a Christian England. This is not a Christian country. There are probably only between 2 and 3% of the population who know Jesus Christ personally. And while 2 mosques a week are being opened, one of our major denominations is closing 2 churches per week. So we are in a totally different situation. We are now in a multicultural, multi-faith society. And the word I want to introduce you to, I'm going to introduce you to quite a lot of difficult words in the first 2 talks. They all end with ISM. They're isms, and there are loads of them. And I'm suspicious of every word that ends with ism. Somehow, behind each word that ends with ism, there's a power that gets hold of people and directs their life towards itself. There are only 2 isms I can cope with. Baptism is one, and evangelism is the other. But all the other isms I am wary of, even religious isms, even Catholicism or Protestantism or Anglicanism or Methodism or Calvinism or Arminianism, they all have this unusual power to get hold of people's thinking. But the first one I want to introduce to you is pluralism. It's a word you're going to hear a lot of. It's a philosophy, an attitude, an outlook which says there are many creeds, many cultures, many faiths, and we must learn to live with that fact and accept each other's faith as valid. Or to put it in very simple terms, you will probably hear it put like this: there are many ways to God. Yet Jesus said, I am the way. There's a contradiction here. You can't believe both. You can't believe that he is the way and believe there are many ways to God. You can believe he's a way and there are many ways, but not the way. So we have a crisis on our hands. And because nations had their own gods in the past, most wars were religious wars. Even Saddam Hussein got on his knees and claimed the backing of Almighty God before he invaded Kuwait this week. Religious wars have been strewn through history because each nation had its God, and when nations went to war, one nation prayed to its God and the other nation prayed to its God, and it became a jihad, a holy war between gods. And because of this fact, now that we are so mixed up, even in our own country, and because the world is a global village and we're all having to live together in it, the modern outlook says the only way to have peace is to stop religious arguments and to stop religious strife and to accept each other's way to God as valid and be tolerant of one another and respect each other's religion. That is now the mood of our society for the sake of social unity and harmony and for the sake of world peace. And it's a cry that's not just coming from outside the church, it's coming from inside the church. Dr. Runcie, the Archbishop of Canterbury, gave a memorable lecture in London a year or two back in which he besought us to look for the Holy Spirit in all religions. The Pope called together different religions of the world in Assisi, noted for St. Francis, and the religions of the world came together there to pray for world peace. In other words, there are now such big issues facing us that we can't afford the luxury of arguing about faith or of discussing differences between religion. What we need to do is accept each other's religion and work together for world peace. There is another pressure too on us to bring religions together, and that is the whole question of the environment. We now realize planet Earth is a little spaceship hurtling through space with a limited number of people on board, a limited amount of fuel, a limited amount of oxygen. And here is a cause for which we all need to unite to save planet Earth. Our survival is at stake, not just peace and harmony, but our very survival depends on us coming together. Last year, in 44 cities, Christians marched for Jesus. There has never been such a widespread public proclamation of Christ as last September. In 44 cities, thousands of Christians marched, but there was not a word in the newspapers, there was not a mention on television. It apparently was totally ignored. Something else happened on the same day, which caught the headlines. At Canterbury, not far from here, there was a celebration of the forest. And different religions came together to Canterbury to celebrate the forest on which we depend for our oxygen. That is going to be a trend which will become very much more prominent in the 90s. There will be a pressure on different religions to come together in order to save planet Earth. And the focus of worship will be on a lady who doesn't exist, called Mother Earth and Mother Nature. Mark my words, there will be a revival of the Old Testament fertility cults, the goddess worship of Mother Earth, against which the Old Testament prophets preach so much. But all these pressures in a pluralist society with many creeds and many cultures are wanting us to get together and to say there are many ways to God and each way is valid. Now, there is nothing new in all this. When the Roman Empire was expanding, it faced the same problem. Because as the Roman Empire expanded, it took in more and more nations with different gods. And here was a potential source of division and strife within the empire. So how did they deal with that to bring about the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the harmony within the empire between the different peoples they had conquered? Well, there were two ways in which they tackled the problem. The first was to erect temples to all gods. In other words, to bring the different gods into the same house of worship so that they could all be worshipped together. And the name for all gods in Greek is Pantheon. And the largest such temple was built in the city of Rome in the year 27 BC. It was burnt down less than 100 years later and rebuilt by the Emperor Hadrian. I was walking on top of Hadrian's wall in Northumberland just a week ago today. But Hadrian also built this huge temple in the middle of Rome, and he called it the Pantheon. It was about the size and shape of the Royal Albert Hall, a big oval building. I've only got a photograph here of the ceiling, which is magnificent. It has a great hole in the ceiling through which you can see the sky. I don't know if you can see the ceiling here with the hole to the sky. It is a magnificent temple. It's still standing. If you go to Rome, you must go and have a look at it. I went there in 1947. That was my first visit to Rome, and I wanted to see the Pantheon. I'd heard about this temple in which there were niches for different gods, and all the statues of the gods could be worshipped together, and this would unite the Roman Empire. I walked into the building and got a shock. I expected to see statues of Jupiter and Zeus and all the other. There wasn't one. The temple was empty of the gods. The only religious object that I could see in there was a wooden cross, because the Pantheon is now a church where Jesus Christ alone is worshipped. That left a deep impression on me. I saw it as a parable. I saw it as a symbol of what will one day happen when all the religions of the world disappear, including churchianity, and only Christ is worshipped. Now, that was one way the Roman Empire tried to tackle the problem of having people of different religions living together in harmony. They also did another thing. By the way, before I leave that, I'd better tell you what happened when they met with the Jews. When they conquered Israel, they said, "Give us one of your gods to put in the Pantheon." And that raised a problem. Two problems, in fact. The Jews said, first, we don't have any statues because our God has forbidden us to have a graven image. What? You have no gods? Yes, we have one God. Well, where is he? Let's see him. No, he's invisible. But surely you have a statue of him. No, we don't. Well, that was the first problem. The second problem was, they said, and our God is the only God who exists. He has told us again and again, there is no one beside me. There is no other God. Therefore, even if we had a statue, we couldn't give it to you, because we wouldn't have our God beside others, because there is no God beside our God. Well, now, they got away with it in a very unusual way. The Roman authorities put their heads together and said, we'll register them as atheists because they haven't got a visible God. And because they had no visible God that you could see, the Jews were registered as atheists. And they got away with it. They didn't have to join in all the religious mumbo-jumbo. But the Christians didn't get away with it. They never got registered. They were the underground church. They were the outlawed church. They were the religio illicita, which meant they were an illegal movement. They didn't get registered as atheists like the Jews did. The other thing that the Roman Empire did to unite all these people of different faiths was to invent a new God that they could all worship. And they decided to deify the Roman Caesar. And they began to call the Roman emperor God. And they said, now you can go on worshiping your own gods as much as you want, but in addition, you must be willing to say Caesar is Lord, because that faith will unite us all. That's just what they did. That is why for 300 years Christians were thrown to the lions, burnt alive, tortured. There was one famous case of a dear lady who had just given birth to a baby, and they put her in a cell, and they put her baby in the next cell, and the baby was crying for milk, and they said to the mother, the moment you acknowledge Caesar as Lord, you can go and feed your baby. But she never did, and she and the baby died for their faith. They would not join in either the pantheon of many gods or the worship of Caesar as God. We are going to be under the same kind of pressures as the world shrinks, as the mobility of population puts religions alongside each other. For the sake of unity and harmony, the pressure is on us to say, Jesus was a way. He's not the way. But Jesus said, I am the way. The only way. Which means two things. It means first that you need no one else when you have Jesus. You need no one else. And secondly, more seriously, it means no one else can help you. Or as Peter put it, some weeks after Jesus died, Peter said, there is no other name given among men under heaven whereby we may be saved. Now that's exclusive, and that's offensive. The whole mood of the world at the moment is to take this pluralist society with its many creeds and cultures and do something else with it. I really wanted another word on there, but I didn't give it in time. So you can write it in on your piece of paper. The word is syncretism. That's another horrible word. But it flows from pluralism. A pluralist society with many religions has a pressure within it to syncretize those religions, to bring them together in one. I'm sure you've all heard of the ecumenical movement that seeks to bring the different Christian denominations together, Protestant and Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Orthodox, Syriac, Coptic. There is a strong move to bring all those who profess Christ together. But what you may not have realized is that there is now a strong move also to engage in dialogue between different religions and bring them all together. Some of you are old enough to remember an American statesman called John Foster Dulles. He was the first man really to get this going, and in the San Francisco Cow Palace, whatever that is, many years ago there was held the first World Congress of Faiths, and all the different religions sent representatives together so that there could be a united act of worship, and readings were taken from the different scriptures. Part of the Sermon on the Mount was read, part of the Quran was read, part of the Holy Vedas were read, and all these scriptures were read, and then the people all prayed together, and this was the program of a syncretistic move in religion. And that is the move that is now really pressing on us very hard, so that we may be one world with one faith and one religion, a united mankind. I was preaching in a little school in the county of Oxfordshire not long ago, and it's a school right out in the country, and I'm sure there wasn't a Muslim within 50 miles. And yet, in the school hall behind me as I spoke was a wall covered with quotations from the Quran, with pictures of mosques, and a complete wall spread of Islam. And I was preaching Christ in front of this backcloth. On another wall was a complete study of the Judaistic faith. Now listen carefully to what I'm going to say now. There is such a thing as comparative religion, but Christianity is not one of them. For actually, Christianity is not a religion at all. And there are teachers now in this country who are facing this pressure. I have counseled teachers who have lost their job because they have said in the staff room, never mind the classroom, the things that I'm going to teach you today, that Christ is unique. In our children's minds in school is being erected a pantheon, a temple to all gods. Many parents are already troubled and concerned and asking me about their children who are being taught this pantheon. You see, the difficulty is that they are told about different religions, how they worship, their festivals and their practice. They're even encouraged to join in the festivals. But they are never told how to judge the truth of each faith. And that is the key issue behind all religions. Are they true? The word true and the word real are the same word in both Hebrew and Greek. And whenever you see the word truth in Scripture, you can substitute the word reality. Jesus said, the truth will set you free. He was saying, reality sets you free. And the real question we have to ask is, how far do the different faiths correspond with reality, with truth? I'll finish this talk by sharing with you an experience I had in Birmingham University. I was invited to go at rather short notice to take part in the student debate in the debating society, in the debating chamber. And the motion that was proposed was that Jesus is the only way to God. And I was asked to go and propose this motion. When I got there, to my surprise, the opposer of the motion was wearing a clerical collar. And the seconder opposing the motion was wearing a wooden cross round her neck. I thought, where am I? Is this Alice in Wonderland? I am proposing the motion that Jesus is the only way to God, and I'm being opposed by an ordained minister and somebody wearing a cross. Well, it was one of the hottest debates I've ever been in, and for 2.5 hours, that room was hotter than this hall. But at the end of it, a vote was taken, and it was something like 85% favored the motion that Jesus is the only way to God. And the president, the student president, was so surprised by this, so tongue-tied, that he announced the motion had been defeated. There were cries from all over the chamber, carried, carried. And he said, I'm sorry, I never expected a motion like that to be carried in this university. But it was. I'm hoping that that motion will be carried in your heart by these talks. But we've already reached a second subject, and that is, what is truth? And the same Jesus who said, I am the way, immediately went on to say, I am the truth. And we shall look at that in the next talk. Pontius Pilate spoke for all of us when he said, "What is truth?" That's a question that philosophers have been teasing their minds with for centuries. It's the same question as asking, what is real? Is this desk real? Am I real? Or do I just think I'm here? Do I think this is here? What is real? What is true? That is, of course, the question we've got to ask about religion. One religion claims there is only one God. Another religion says there are 30 million gods. Another religion says there are no gods at all. Christianity says there are 3 persons in one God, which is different from all the others. The real question is not what we believe, but is it true? You can be sincerely wrong. It does matter what you believe. And Pilate had this same skepticism that many people today have. What is truth? How do we know? How do we find out? Who knows? How can you know? Actually, the answer to his question was standing 6 feet in front of him. Because Jesus said, "I am the truth." That is an extraordinary claim. And again, I want to show you why that claim is so unacceptable today. I want you to realize how difficult it is to believe that Christ is unique in the 20th century Western world. I've got to introduce you to 3 more isms. After this talk, we're finished with them. That will be a relief to you. But here are 3 important isms we've got to learn about. Number 1, rationalism. Until 300 years ago, in Europe at any rate, if you asked a person what is truth, they would have a simple answer. Truth is what God tells us. And if you asked, well, how does God tell us? They would probably have answered through the church or through the Bible. The great shift that took place at the time of the Reformation was that people began to question whether what the church said was what God was saying, and turned instead to what the Bible said. But at least they had this in common, both Catholics and Protestants at that time. The truth was what God said. If God said something, that was true, that was real. You didn't argue about it. You could either accept or reject it, but that's how truth came. It was revealed from God's mind to human beings, and you didn't argue about that. But then came a great shift in human thinking about 300 years ago. We call it the Enlightenment. I'm not sure that it wasn't a step into the dark, actually, but the switch was this. Truth is no longer what God tells us, but what we find out for ourselves. To put it simply, human reason replaced divine revelation. You no longer accepted unquestionably what the church or the Bible taught. You thought it through for yourself. You used your own common sense. Truth was what I think. That is the heart of rationalism. It made man self-sufficient. He could discover truth for himself. He didn't need God to help him. Man could discover it with the use of his own mind, through his own senses, which of course opened the whole field for scientific discovery. It's interesting that most of the scientists who laid the foundation of modern science still believed in God. People like Galileo, Isaac Newton, Bacon, Copernicus, all of them believed that they were thinking God's thoughts after him, but they were discovering them for themselves. And that eventually led to a new philosophy we call deism. There's another ism for you, which believes that God created the world but no longer controls it, that the world is like a watch that somebody has wound up and must go on its own way now and can't be altered. It operates according to its own laws. So while still believing in God, many of these scientists believed that God himself could not change the order of nature. And so they gave their minds to discover the laws of nature and became rather proud of their discovery, and then their manipulation of nature, because all science discovers how nature operates so that we may change how it operates by using the laws of nature to manipulate nature itself. So by unaided reason, we became the people in charge of our universe. In other words, the authority of human reason took over from the authority of divine revelation. And this introduced an age of skepticism which is still with us. People no longer believe a thing just because they are told. They want to find out for themselves whether it is true, whether it appeals to their logic, whether they can understand it. But it's tragic when man will only believe what he understands or what he can discover for himself, because we shall never fully understand God, nor can we discover God. There is no telescope or microscope that can examine him. In fact, what happens as the result of rationalism is that we become obsessed with creation rather than the Creator, because science can tell you nothing about the Creator. It can only tell you about the creation, which has lowered our vision from heaven to earth. It has brought us down to the material world in which we live. That was the first great shift 300 years ago, from divine revelation, God says it, so it must be true, to human reason. I can't understand it, so it can't be true. Or you've got to explain it to me before I'll believe it's true. Now that produced the cold, clinical intellectualism of science. And there has also been a reaction against that into the warmth of a movement we call Romanticism, which said human beings are not only thinking creatures, but feeling creatures. And reality needs to be felt. What is true is what I feel to be true. And so there came not just a desire for a scientific explanation of things, but a desire for an experience of things, which really came to a head with the existentialist movement of our day, in which people want to feel something. They don't feel it's real unless they felt it. That is even the test some people apply to worship. It hasn't been good worship because I didn't feel anything. That's very typical of the Romanticism that has now flooded our Western society. So you had the cold, clinical rationalism, which led to the field of science, and we have the Romanticism, which led more into the field of arts, into the field of painting, of music. And these were to help us to feel reality. So again, people looked at the world around us and wanted to feel it. Much music has been inspired by nature. We need to feel the music. And music essentially touches us at an emotional rather than an intellectual level. If you can't understand modern art, you've understood it. Because what it is saying is, the world doesn't make sense. I look at it, and it's crazy. It's a nonsense. So if you don't understand modern art or music, you do understand it, because they are saying you can't understand it. They're saying life is a riddle, it's absurd, it's a joke. But I can feel it. So we have these two very human and subjective approaches to the question, what is truth? Rationalism says truth is what my mind can explain. Romanticism says truth is what my heart can experience. And Jesus said, I am the truth, which contradicts both of those. Because if Jesus is the truth, then truth is not inside us. It's outside us, it's in him. Whereas rationalism said the truth is inside your mind. And romanticism says the truth is inside your heart. And so we have the scientist who explores outer space, and we have the artist who explores inner space. But they're both looking for reality, for truth. What is for real? Now, if you add together rationalism and romanticism, you come up with the realism I wanted to talk to you about, relativism. And that is the mood of our era. In simple terms, the mood of our day is that truth is relative. It is not absolute. In simple terms, you can't be sure. You can hold an opinion, but you mustn't ever say to someone, I know the truth. You must say, this is my idea of the truth. This is my opinion. This is my understanding. This is my feeling. But then you must recognize that somebody else thinks differently and feels differently. So truth for them is different to truth for you. And all things become relative. In such an atmosphere, it is offensive to be dogmatic. To say, I know, is now offensive. To say, I think or I feel, that's okay. But to say, I know, who do you think you are? You are only saying what you think and feel. Truth is relative. I think and feel differently. And we shall only arrive at the whole truth by pooling all our different insights and aspects of the truth. That we've all got a little bit of the truth. And we need to bring it all together into one big truth, and then we might get somewhere near the truth. That's relativism. In other words, in a relativistic atmosphere in which we have to witness to Jesus Christ today, there is no such division as true and false, or right and wrong. All is relative. Nothing is black and white, everything is gray. Therefore, you must never say, that is wrong. Let's take an example. Islam says that God is not a father. Islam has 99 names for God, but Father is not one of them. Nor is love, interestingly enough. And the reason they say he must not be called Father is, as the Quran states, that God has no son. Yet we are here because we believe that God is a father, because he has a son. Now, in an absolute age, one of those must be true and the other false. But in a relativist age, you can say they're both true. They're both aspects of truth. That's how Christians see truth, that's how Muslims see truth. But the real question is, which is true? What is truth? So a relativist age does not like people who say this is wrong. A relativist age says everybody's right, which of course again keeps the peace. But it means that any clear, strong preaching, this is right and that is wrong, is unacceptable in modern thinking. Therefore, the Bible is being questioned as a source of absolute truth. It is now being regarded as a record of relative truth. And the favorite phrase I keep reading today is this: the Bible is culturally conditioned. Now, what is meant by that phrase? It means it's a reliable record of how the people in that day and at that time and in that situation understood truth. But it is not necessarily truth for us today, because we live 2,000 years later and 2,000 miles away in a technological society. Therefore, we can study the Bible for relative truth and study it. It is a reliable record of what they believed then, but it is not a reliable guide to absolute truth today. It is culturally conditioned. Jesus himself was a child of his time. That is what he sincerely believed. That is what he honestly thought was true. But we can rethink in our new situation truth for us in the light of truth for him. Are you getting the picture? The serious side of this lack of true and false in belief is the lack of right and wrong in behavior. And you must have noticed that no longer are there clear moral guidelines. Let me take an example. There's a well-known bishop, whom I needn't name because you know, who was on television answering questions from school children. And one of the children, a boy of about 10 years of age, said, "Bishop, is it all right to have sex before marriage?" And the bishop answered something like this. He said, well, it would depend on the circumstances. If it was sheer promiscuity, then that would be wrong. But if a couple intend to get married and love each other and really want to be committed to each other, then that's a different situation. In other words, it's now relative. There is no black and white. Fornication is relative. There are different types of it, and it depends on the circumstances whether it is right and wrong. And then he noticed that it was a little boy of 10 who'd asked this, and he said to the boy, "Why did you ask?" And the boy said, "Well, you don't believe in the virgin birth, so if Jesus was not born of a virgin, then Joseph and Mary must have had sex before marriage, so it's all right." It was the first time he'd realized the implications of what he'd been saying for some years. And he looked a bit shattered and then said something like this. He said, "Well, the Lord is able even to use our sin to glorify his name." In other words, he was saying Jesus was born of fornication, which is what many believe in our world today. But you see, the whole thing had become relative. Because he could no longer accept the Bible statement of the virgin birth as absolute truth, he was now caught up in a relative view of ethics and behavior. It's technically called situational ethics. You don't say to someone it's wrong to steal. There is a question to be asked first. Why are you stealing? What is the situation? There's no longer a clear line, don't lie. There are now 3 sorts of lie, black, white, and statistics. And it was an ancestor of mine who invented the word statistics, for which may he be forgiven. But my grandfather was preaching in Manchester at the turn of the century, and he said, there are black lies and white lies. And a Yorkshire voice in the crowd shouted out, "Nay, lad, they're all black uns." But that's an absolute statement. It's all right to steal from the company, but stealing from your workmate is wrong. Why? Have you got the message? We live in a relative age. Truth is no longer absolute, so morals are no longer absolute. There is no such thing as true and false, so there is no such thing now as right and wrong. Everything shades off. And indeed, it means that we can be pretty subjective. We can decide what's true and false. We can decide what's right and wrong. We can eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We can make the decisions. That's the relativist atmosphere in which we preach the uniqueness of Christ, that he is the truth. We're not saying he told the truth, or even that he had the truth. We're saying he is the truth, which means that it is by him that you can judge everything else. It is by him that you can know whether somebody is speaking truth or falsehood. It's by him that you can know whether a person is real or unreal. He is the truth. But in an age in which rationalism and romanticism has produced this relativism of what I think and feel and what you think and feel, it's all true. Everybody's got some little insight. Nobody has the truth. Well, certainly, as a Christian, I would not want to make what sounds like an arrogant statement, I have the truth, but what I would say is the truth has me. That's different. We do not say what we say because we believe we have the truth, but because the truth got hold of us when a person got hold of us. In a relativist age, taste and trends replace truth. And you follow the crowd. You become a chameleon. You know what a chameleon is, don't you? A chameleon, if you put it on red, it turns red. If you put it on blue, it turns blue. I'm told the way to kill a chameleon is to put it on tartan. And it bursts. I've never tried it, but so I'm told. But if we're not careful, what we're doing is we are picking up the fashion of thinking from our TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, and we're following trends in thought. And trends are changing so rapidly these days that they reckon no fashion lasts longer than 4 years. So we're going to be a bunch of chameleons unless we find the truth and stay with it. And Jesus said, that's what I am. If you find me, you've found the truth. But that is terribly offensive. Now we're going to go a little further. Jesus not only said, I am the way and the truth, he also said, I am the life. And my problem now was how many isms to include. I could have put 30 or 40. We're talking about these isms as outlooks and attitudes that capture people's lives, that give them a purpose for living. Because one of the biggest questions in life is, what is life all about? Why am I here? I've only got one chance to make the most of this life. What can I give my life to? What can be the direction or goal or purpose of my life to make the most of it? Otherwise, life is like a roundabout. You get on, you go round and round, you have a great time while you're on, but you get off exactly where you got on. And you've lost your money. So what is life all about? What could I most purposefully do with the 70 years that I've got? And here we are being bombarded with a whole lot of isms that are saying, give your life to this. This is what life is all about. And I just run through a few of them that once you have labeled them, you will recognize them while you're watching the goggle box. Now let's look at the first, hedonism. That says that the purpose of life is the pursuit of pleasure. The main goal of life is to be happy. And many people believe this. And this is the goal of their life. This is the life for them. Anything that will bring them pleasure, whether it's a trip on marijuana or a trip to Mallorca, doesn't matter. Trouble with all these trips is you have to come back again. But hedonism is one of the most widespread philosophies of our day. And of course, there are two things you need for that. Number one, health. Number two, wealth. Those are the two things you need to be happy. So you must pursue those two things with all you've got. That's why you can go to so many health shops today and pay 3 times the amount for a loaf of bread. To be healthy. We become terribly conscious of health. I remember going to the Gold Coast in Australia and seeing retired people in their 70s and even 80s jogging up and down the beach every morning in the sun. And I looked at them and I thought, why? Why are they doing this? They're doing it because health is happiness. Hang on to your health as long as you can. But why? What is the purpose? Well, to be happy, as long as ever you can. And of course, it also requires, as well as health and wealth, it requires time. And since our time, most of it is out of our hands, either sleeping or working, it means we need leisure. And we must have more and more leisure in order to live, in order to enjoy ourselves. That's one ism. A second ism is existentialism. And basically this philosophy says, if you want to live, you must be in charge of your life. You must make the decisions. Whatever decision it is, at least you made it. You were king in your own life. And you decided how you were going to live and where you were going to live. I suppose a song that sums this up more than any other was Frank Sinatra's hit, I Did It My Way. And it touched a chord around the world. People who felt within their own little sphere they'd made decisions, they'd moved house, they'd been in charge of their own life, and somehow that was satisfying. The ultimate decision, of course, to make for yourself is to die. I mean to commit suicide. And there have been many, many suicides come out of this philosophy. That is the last thing I can decide to do. I did it my way. I cut my own throat. I did it my way. I was in Berlin once and heard Cliff Richard sing his own version of that song. Can't remember the words. He's forbidden by copyright to sing it here, apparently, but I wish he could. It was called I Did It His Way. And he changed all the words. And you could see the fulfillment in his face as he sang it. But existentialism says the purpose of your life is to make your own decisions, steer your own course, even if it means taking your own life, but do it your way. A third ism is conservationism. I've already touched on this in the earlier talk, but this is becoming a cause for which people are going to devote their lives to saving the whale. I remember seeing a procession of women in another country protesting about the slaughter of baby seals. They had their banners, protect the baby seals. And I know that some of them had aborted their own babies. What a crazy world we live in. Save the seals, but destroy our own. What a scale of values. But the whole environment question is becoming an obsession. And I can understand it because Christians are the only people who know that this planet Earth is not the only one there's going to be. Therefore, we do not panic, though we are concerned. But we know there is going to be a new Earth. But those who don't know that, who think this is the only Earth we'll ever have, feel that the greatest cause to which you can devote your life is to preserve the environment, to save the endangered species, to stop the greenhouse effect. That's worth giving your life to. The ark, said one such person, the ark is now the earth itself. Then there is humanitarianism, the welfare of the deprived. According to this, Bob Geldof could be more fulfilled than Billy Graham. And there are those who devote their lives to the underprivileged and the exploited, the liberation of the oppressed, that here is a cause worth giving your life to give you the purpose and direction that will help you reach the end of it with satisfaction. The Eurovision song from Britain just summed this up. Give a little love back to the world. I was surprised that it didn't win, because the lyrics, at least, would touch many a human chord. Look after the handicapped. Free the oppressed. But many feel that doing that for individuals is not a big enough cause. What we need is to change the structures of society. We need not just welfare, but political change if we are going to bring the human race into the life it should have. And so we have many political isms, of which I pick out two. The two we're most familiar with in this country. There is capitalism, which says that if we're going to live the full life we need to stimulate production. We need to capture the profit motive. We need to introduce the competitive spirit. We need to encourage individual initiative to produce the wealth that will make us all happy. At the opposite end, we have socialism, which says it's not the production of wealth that is the problem, but the distribution of it. And what we need is more control by the state to see that the wealth that is created is more equally shared out, from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. To my mind, both of these isms are totally naive about human nature. They seem to believe that human nature is basically good. Capitalism believes that once we've created the wealth, we'll all be giving it away to the needy, which doesn't seem to happen. And socialism believes that if we're all working for the state or working therefore for the people, then we shall have more motivation to work than ever before. It's naive. What I saw in the Eastern Europe bloc tells me that that kills initiative dead. See, both isms think that human nature is basically good. If we change the structures, change the system, everything will work perfectly. That is not the truth. Jesus, who said, "I am the truth," also said that he would not put his trust in any man because he knew what was in man. And it was he who said, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good things to your children," being evil, that's the truth about yourself. And you find it out when you get to know the truth, who is Jesus. Two more and then we're through. There is humanism. Humanism basically is the deification of man. I seem to go in for university debates, and one other debate I had was in a university not far from here. It was a debate on humanism versus Christianity. And my opponent there was a professor of education, an atheist Jew, and a very clever man. And he spoke first, and while he was speaking, I thought, help, I can't match that. He was brilliant. But he finished his talk with these words. He said, "So you can see that I, as a humanist, believe that man can solve all his own problems. And if he can't, then God help us." And the place erupted. The students cheered and laughed. And I just got up and said my text to the last three words of the previous speaker, God help us. Humanists believe that man has come of age, that he's grown up, that he no longer needs gods out there, he no longer needs heavenly help. Man is now able to solve his own problems. He is perfectly capable of doing so if he gives himself to the task. We have within us all that we need to get ourselves out of all our troubles. That's humanism. Very common belief. Again, it believes that human nature is basically good, and that we have within us the power to make this world a perfect place to live in. I believe it's naive, but it's a man-centered culture. And now it's taking on a religious form. I'm sure you've heard of the New Age movement. I'm not going to go into it in detail now, but at the heart of the New Age movement is the deification of man. That you are God yourself. And if you'd only realize that and practice it, you'd find you can be God in the universe. And it's taking many forms at the moment. It's basically humanism in a different dress. And finally, secularism, which I've called the privatization of religion. What do I mean by that? It's an outlook that says religion is purely a private, personal affair and must not be allowed to intrude into public life. And so our public life is becoming more and more secular, which means more and more divorced from religion. I was reading a list the other day of the most godless societies in the world. And you may be shattered to know that out of 250 nations, Japan was considered the most godless, the most secular, the most irreligious. But second out of 250 was the United Kingdom. We are the second most materialist, godless, secular society in the whole world. With all the church and chapel buildings scattered around, we are still the second most godless. We are becoming a secular society in which more and more of public life is unrelated to any religious aspect, in which the spiritual dimension, if you want to have it, then keep it as a personal hobby. Don't bring it into public life. Don't let it affect industry or politics or entertainment or sport. And we're beginning to see the results of a secularist outlook. I am disturbed that even Christians are using that word in the wrong way. I talk to Christians and they say, I'm in a secular job. What do they mean by that? There is nothing secular except sin to the Christian. And whatever your job, housewife, taxi driver, farmer, whatever, that's your sacred calling. Unless you are doing it in a way that is totally unrelated to God. But we live in a society that is increasingly influenced by secularism that says don't bring religion into public life. Keep it private. Keep it personal. Now, I've just looked at some of these isms, but when I listed them, I thought of Jesus. He didn't have sex. He didn't have money. Had hardly any leisure. He never did his own thing, only did his Father's will. He didn't seem to do much about protecting nature. He destroyed 2,000 pigs to save one man's sanity. And he cursed a fig tree when he didn't find any fruit on it. He did feed the hungry on 2 occasions, but he didn't open any soup kitchens or hospitals or schools or clinics. He didn't tell industry what to do. He paid his poll tax, though he actually sent Peter fishing for it. He refused to join the freedom fighters to change the political structures. They were called zealots in those days. We would call them terrorists now. He wouldn't trust any man. He said that love of neighbor must come second to love of God. And above all, he put God at the center of his life. He was the opposite almost of all those things. And yet he said, I am the life. Now, I think I've shown you in these first 2 talks that to say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life in our modern world is an offensive thing. So we have to ask now, by what right do we say these things? What grounds have we for claiming such incredible things about our Lord Jesus Christ? In the next 4 talks, we're going to look at Jesus, and we're going to study his life and ask what was unique about him, so unique that we can say these things. Well, we've been looking at the way our world thinks and why it is so difficult today to claim that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But now we're going to look at Jesus to see whether his life substantiates that claim, what grounds we have for what we say he is. And the first thing we need to say about Jesus is that he was a real human being. 100 years ago, it was quite the fashion to write books to prove that Jesus never lived, that he was a figment of someone's imagination, that he was a legend, but didn't actually live. Now, we rarely hear of any books like that today for a very simple reason. In the last 100 years, there have been many discoveries of ancient records and documents and manuscripts right outside the Bible which mention Jesus. We now have over 40 references to him apart from the scriptures, so that nobody now doubts that there was a person called Jesus. And it's interesting that one of the facts which all these records point to is that he did miracles, or was believed to have done miracles. That's the almost universal testimony of all the records we have. And I want to emphasize that he was a real human being, that he was tired, that he was thirsty, that he was hungry, that he had to go to the toilet just like you and I do. He mentions that he was happy, that he was sad, that he was angry, that he could get excited, that he could be very disappointed. He was a real human being. But he never wrote a book. He never traveled the world. He never erected a monument. He never married or had a family or left a son to carry on the business. Never went into politics. Never went into business. He had a trade rather than a profession. Came from very humble origins. Nazareth was a little village that nobody thought highly of. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? He worked with his hands, not his head, never had a home of his own, and only lived 33 years, less than half the average life. And we only know about 3 of those 33 years. Of the first 30 years, we have only one tiny glimpse, and we know nothing more. So it's on those 3 years that we're going to have to concentrate. In fact, it's true that we have more information about his death than his life. If you read the gospel stories of Jesus, you'll find that 1/3 of the pages are about his death and his last few hours. In fact, it's almost like an express train slowing up. In the early part of Mark's gospel, you seem to be rushing through the weeks and months, and straightway he did this, and straightway he did that, and straightway he went somewhere else. And then it gradually slows up. The months become weeks. And then we get to the last week, and the week becomes days. And then we get to the last day, and the day becomes hours. It's almost as if the whole thing is leading up to his death, which is rather unusual. About most great people in history, we know far more about their life than their death. It's quite clear that he was a very controversial figure and that he made friends and enemies very quickly. In fact, very few people remain neutral about this carpenter from Nazareth. They were either for him or against him. And that has happened ever since, where you talk about him. It divides people down the middle, and people take up a negative or a positive attitude very quickly to this person who said he was the way and the truth and the life. We're going to examine his public life, the 3 years when he was center stage in the drama of human history, and we're going to ask what was unique about this life. What was different about it? What was so special that people came to believe that what he claimed to be was nothing less than the sober truth? There are 3 aspects of his life we want to look at: what he did, what he was, and what he said. Those are the three aspects of any life. And together they make up a picture which gives you an insight into the personality. We're going to ask particularly the question, who did people think he was? And even more important, who did he think he was? The Jews of his day once asked that very question, who does he think he is? And that's the question we've got to answer. I want to start with what he did. And I start by talking about his miraculous power. All the records we have, both inside the Bible and outside the Bible, point to this activity, that Jesus of Nazareth did miracles. And there were two kinds of miracles that he did. There were his miracles on people, which many people today can accept, and there were his miracles on things, which many people of today can't accept. It seems that our understanding of psychosomatic disorders helps us to understand his miracles with people, but doesn't help us to understand his miracles with things. Basically, there were three kinds of miracles he did with people. The first is that he healed diseases, that many different kinds of sickness were brought to him, from leprosy, which was probably the most serious and roughly equivalent to AIDS today, in that on the one hand it was totally incurable and a slow death, and on the other hand separated you from your family and friends and caused you to live in isolation. So that leprosy had the same kind of emotional feel about it as AIDS do today. And Jesus healed them all. There isn't one recorded case of him failing to heal anyone he sought to heal. There are records in the Bible of him turning away from sick people when they wanted to be healed, but he didn't believe that the Father was telling him to heal on that day, and he left Capernaum, High Street, full of sick people, on one occasion because he told his disciples, "Father's told me to preach in the next city." So that while it's not true that he healed everybody in that country who was sick, he did heal everybody he sought to heal. At the pool of Bethesda, he only healed one out of many sick people, but he didn't have a single failure. Then he also cast out demons. Until about 15, 20 years ago, people thought this was just another word for mental illness. We now know there is a huge difference between demonic possession and mental illness. Someone of my acquaintance claimed this, and a doctor challenged him to prove it. So he said, "Take me to the nearest mental hospital." And they went, and then my friend said, "I'm going to pray for the people here, and the people who are mentally ill will become more peaceful as I pray for them, but the people who have demons will go berserk and become aggressive." And sure enough, as they prayed, these two things happened to different patients. And then he said, "Now the mental illness will take time to cure, but those who have demons can be released immediately." And he proceeded to go and do that. So he demonstrated very clearly that there is a difference. We now know there are personal, intelligent beings who are actually fallen angels, who are demons, and that they can possess a person, take them over. And Jesus cast out demons. But the most startling thing he did with people was to raise the dead. He did this on a number of occasions with a little girl, Jairus' daughter, with a young man, the widow of Nain's son, and that happened at the funeral itself, and above all with Lazarus, who'd been 4 days in his grave. So these were the miracles he did with people: healing diseases, casting out demons, raising from the dead. But then he also did miracles with things. The first miracle he did with a thing was to change water into wine. Not, as one pastor in America tried to persuade me, into tomato juice. It was wine, and the best wine of the wedding reception. He did that in Cana of Galilee. It's interesting that his first temptation was to turn stones into bread, whereas his first miracle was to turn water into wine. What's the difference? Why was one wrong and the other right? The answer is very simple. The temptation was to turn stones into bread for himself, whereas he turned the water into wine for other people. That's a big difference. But he also fed the 5,000. I think that's one of the funniest stories in the New Testament. I wish people would read the Bible for the human dimension and not just for divine truth. It's really a very funny story. Jesus was preaching much longer than I'm going to preach to you today, and the people were hungry. So he said to the disciples, they're hungry. Give them some food. Now that's where the humor comes in, because he knew that each of the disciples had brought some food. He also knew that just a short while before he said it, they'd been into the bushes, hidden themselves, and eaten all their food before anybody else had a chance to see they'd got any. That's why he said, give them some food. He must have been smiling when he said it. How do I know this? Because they had 12 empty baskets. Right? And so he said, give them some food. And they said, oh, nobody could get enough food to feed this crowd. It's impossible. He said, give them some food. Come on, give me some of yours. And they looked around and found a poor little boy who had brought some, and he saw his loaves and fishes vanish, grabbed by the disciples. Here's some. And then Jesus took a loaf of bread and broke some, give that to that group, give that to that group, and just went on creating bread in his hand and creating fish. People have tried to explain it away by saying that when the disciples lent gave their food to others, everybody brought their picnic out and everybody shared around. Rubbish. The disciples had already eaten theirs. And then Jesus, knowing everything, after everybody had eaten, said, now you can collect some food for your own supper. And they filled up their 12 baskets again, had enough left over. The Lord is still doing that. Some of you may have seen the video Viva Cristo Rey about the church in Mexico, where the Holy Spirit directed them to take Christmas dinners to the garbage pickers, who got a few pesetas for recycling metal and glass from the rubbish tip. And they prepared enough Christmas dinners for about 120, but discovered to their horror there were 250. And so they just started giving out the food, and they gave it out and gave it out until all 250 had a full Christmas dinner, and then still had enough for themselves left over. That was only the beginning. Since then they've had multiplication of beans, dried milk, and a host of other things. Jesus is still doing it. Then what else did he do? Told the wind and the waves to shut up. He didn't say, peace be still. That's the polite English versions that say that. He said, get muzzled, which is the way you talk to a naughty puppy dog that's jumping up at your friends. And he just treated the wind and the waves like a puppy dog. And the disciples said, what kind of a man is this that can tell the wind and the waves what to do? Then there's that strange business about the fig tree. It wasn't the time for the harvest of figs, but Jesus was hungry, and sometimes on a fig tree there are some early figs that come before the others. And he was hoping to find some of those to assuage his hunger, and he found a tree that had nothing with but leaves on it. So he cursed it. And the next day as they walked past, the tree was dead. All the leaves were on the ground. They said, Master, that tree you cursed is dead. He said, that's nothing. If you had faith the size of a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, jump in the sea, and it would go. Now, could I ask you, how many of you believe that? Could I just see that you can tell a mountain to jump in the sea? I'm going to assume that everybody who puts their hand up has tried it and done it. But it has been done. There was an orphanage in Japan run by the Japan Evangelistic Band, and it was full of children, too full, and more orphans were being brought to it. And they thought we must try and enlarge the orphanage to take more children, but they couldn't. It was already 5 stories high, which is as high as you can go in an earthquake zone. It had a street on that side, a street at the front, and a street on this side, but at the back was a steep little hill. So they couldn't extend the orphanage anyway. And one of the missionaries laughingly made a joke and said, of course, what we should do is tell the hill at the back to jump in the sea, and we could extend the orphanage backwards. And the other missionaries roared with laughter. It was a sort of in-joke for Christians. But the children overheard, and the orphans prayed. They said, Jesus, throw the mountain in the sea so we can have more children. They went away to the seaside for their holidays for 2 weeks. When they came back, the ground behind the orphanage was flat. The hill had gone. And the missionaries couldn't believe it. But the children said, oh yes, we did that. We told Jesus to throw it in the sea. Well, the missionaries were too curious and asked the neighbors what had happened. And the neighbors said, well, actually what happened was this. They are reclaiming land from the harbor. And they built a dam out into a shallow part of the sea to get some more land for warehouses for the goods. And they looked around for some dirt and soil to throw in behind the dam. And somebody on the council said, well, there's that hill behind the orphanage. And it's doing nothing. It doesn't look very attractive. So they'd sent an army of bulldozers, and they'd take that hill and they'd thrown it in the sea. So it has been done. And why have I told you that? Because Jesus' miracles were not unique. It is not his miracles that make him unique. The miracles he did had been done before. Elisha had fed thousands of people with 5 loaves. Elisha had raised the dead. Moses had told the wind and the waves what to do and parted the Red Sea. So that these miracles had been done before. The miracles that Jesus did were also being done during his time by others. When they accused him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, he said, that's very strange. How can I use the power of Satan to cast out Satan? And if I'm using the power of Satan to cast out demons, by what power are you casting out demons? Which shows that they were also engaged in a ministry of exorcism at the same time. Furthermore, Jesus made it quite clear that his miraculous power was not unique. Dare I put it this way, Jesus did not do miracles because he was the Son of Man, but because he was the Son of God, but because he was the Son of Man filled with the Holy Spirit. Which is why he was able to tell his disciples, the miracles I've been doing, you can do and will do too. And greater works than I have done you will do. I'm constantly being asked by Christians, what do you think the greater works are? And I said, don't bother your head about that until you're doing all the works he did. Then you'll be ready to go on to the greater things. I have problems catching up with the first part of that promise. But when they saw Jesus walking on the water one day without sinking, Peter said, could I do that? And Jesus said, be my guest. So Peter said, I'm going to stay here in the boat until I have a real assurance from the Holy Spirit that I have the gift of walking on water. He did not say that. And he did not say, I'm staying in the boat and I'm going to buy every book on every Christian bookstall on walking on water. I'm going to study this gift. I'm really going to get to know all about it, and then I might try it. Well, Peter didn't have a chance to go to any Christian bookstores. There were none. Peter got out of the boat and found he could do it until he took his eyes off Jesus. So there is nothing exclusive about Jesus' miraculous power. I think the most I could say is that he did more miracles than anyone else, and that he never failed when he tried to do one. And I don't think that's probably true of everyone else. But I want to emphasize that it was not his miraculous power that makes him unique. There must be something more than that, because the miracles were done by others before he came, while he was here, and afterwards, and have continued to be done. I have just recently heard about the first cases of AIDS being healed in the name of Jesus. I was waiting to hear that. And it's happened in Central Africa, where, as you probably know, that condition is raging right through the heart of that continent. Peter later preached like this. He said, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with power, and then he went about doing good. See, Jesus didn't do a single miracle until he was 30 years of age. Not until the Holy Spirit came on him was he able to do anything miraculous. And if the Holy Spirit can come on us, then that has far-reaching implications. So let me turn to something else. We've considered his miraculous power, but let's now consider what I want to call his moral purity. What he was. Because in fact what he was raised more questions than what he did. The people had heard about miracles in the past, now they were seeing them, and they certainly wanted them, and it certainly drew the crowds to see what he was doing. But that's not what finally raised the big question. So we're looking a little deeper now at the 3 years he was in the public eye, and we look at what he was. And here is something that really brings us very near to the uniqueness of Christ. There are 3 strange facts about Jesus which I want to mention. And when you take them together, they really are astonishing. The first fact is that he had the strictest moral standards of any moral teacher in history. Nobody has ever demanded a higher standard of living from others than Jesus did. Moses' law was pretty strict. It had 613 commandments in it, 10 big ones, 513 little ones. And when you study them, who could possibly keep them? I am breaking the law of Moses now because St. Michael is my patron saint. And everything I'm wearing I got from my patron saint, literally. And it is breaking the law of Moses, though St. Michael works for a Jewish firm called Marks and Spencer's. And yet that Jewish firm has sold me trousers and a shirt and socks of mixed material, which is forbidden in the law of Moses. You can't mix cotton and wool, much less wool and nylon or whatever. So I'm breaking the law. There's a law of Moses that says if you get dry rot in your house, you must burn your house down out of love for your neighbor, lest your neighbor gets it. Sure, you like that law, don't you? And you'd obey it, wouldn't you? And there are laws covering an extension to your house. If it has a flat roof, it must have a railing around the edge, lest your neighbor's children climb up and fall over and hurt themselves. If you love your neighbor, you won't build an extension with a flat roof without a railing. And the laws of Moses cover every aspect of your life. Your toilet arrangements, your marriage, your money, your work, your clothes, your food. Very strict law. But Jesus' law was much stricter. That is the amazing thing. Moses said you mustn't murder anyone. Jesus said you mustn't despise them or be angry with them or call them a fool, because that's murdering them in your spirit. That's wishing them dead, which he said in my book is as bad as murder. Moses said you mustn't commit adultery. Jesus said if you look at a woman and wish you could take her to bed, you're already doing it. That's my law. And then he said there's a legal way of committing adultery. He said whoever divorces and remarries, except the divorce on the ground of adultery, whoever divorces and remarries is committing adultery in my book. That is now too strict even for churches, as I found to my cost in America. Jesus was very strict, and listen to this. He said, I forbid you to commit the sin of worry. And that's why you never see a Christian worried. Have you noticed? Because His holiness includes no worry. He said, if you worry, you are actually libeling your Father in heaven. You're saying He cares more about His garden and His pets than He does about His kids. That He clothes the grass of the field and feeds the birds of the air. But me, I'm just His child. I have to worry. I heard of a notice outside a church which said, why pray when you can worry? I like that kind of notice. It makes people sit up and think and has a little bit of humor in it. But that's what Jesus said. That's pretty strict, isn't it? He said you should always let your yes be yes and your no be no. Shouldn't have to add anything to your speech. You shouldn't have to say, honestly. The person who says, honestly, doesn't believe that they'll be held to be telling the truth. Don't say honestly, much less by God or by heaven. Just say yes, and let people know that when you say yes, you mean yes. When you say no, you mean no. So people can trust everything you say. This is strict. It's very practical, but it's a very, very high standard. Nobody has ever been so strict as to try and control your thoughts and your feelings. Most teachers have said this is how you must act, but Jesus dared to say this is how you must think. This is how you must feel. He taught a very strict standard of holiness. That's the first fact I want you to hold in your mind. Now here's the second. He lived up to it himself. Now it's one thing to teach, it's another thing to live. My grandfather always used to write in autograph albums, he whose sermon is a godly life will never preach too long. And he had a godly life, and he didn't preach too long. Jesus practiced what he preached. So much so that even his best friends felt they didn't want to be near him. Peter said, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord. I'm not for the likes of you. And he even said to his worst enemies, which of you convicts me of sin? Which of you can find a fault in me? Come on. And they were silent. That's not a challenge I'd give to my best friends, never mind my worst enemies. And on the night before he died, Jesus said, Satan has nothing on me. And there's not a man or woman in this room now, including your preacher, who could ever say that. Satan can remind you of things that would immediately bring a blush to your cheek. He said, Satan's got nothing on me. He didn't expect of other people anything more than he expected of himself. If he expected them to live such a high standard, he lived it himself. Now comes the third fact, and the one that is a shock when you combine it with the other two. First, there is the fact of his teaching and what a high standard of morality he taught. Then there is the fact that he lived it, that he managed to do it himself. Now comes the third big shock, and it is that sinners loved him. Now that's the exact opposite of what you would expect from the first two, isn't it? A man who teaches such moral standards and who lives like that is usually a man who's left alone. He may be respected, even admired from a distance, but people generally don't like to go out for the evening with him. They ostracize him, maybe even send him to Coventry. But the amazing thing is that people who were breaking his standards, who weren't living that way, loved him, so much so that his enemies coined a title for him, friend of sinners. And that's one of the most beautiful titles that could be given. Abraham was called the friend of God. Jesus was called the friend of sinners. A year or two back, I was in Canada and was invited to take part in a program, a chat program, on the Global Network, which is the main commercial channel. It goes right across the Dominion and into parts of America. And the producer said to me, "David, you can talk about anything you like for 20 minutes. Boy, I wish the BBC would occasionally give me that invitation. He said, "What do you want to talk about?" I said, "I want to talk about the kingdom of God. That's my favorite subject." And his face fell. He said, "But look, this is a commercial channel. We have to keep people interested. We've got to keep them switched on." He said, "Do you think they'll be interested?" I said, I don't know if they will or not. I don't care. You said I could talk about anything I like for 20 minutes. I'm going to hold you to your promise." And he let me. And when the little red light went on camera 1, I began to talk about the kingdom of God. There were telephones in the studio for viewers to ring in. And the first telephone rang, and a woman's voice said, "Hello, I'm a hooker." Now, in Canadian, that's prostitute. She said, "I'm a hooker, Yonge Street, Toronto." That's the red light district over there. And she said, "I've been watching your program, and I've got a question I'd like to ask." I said, "What's your question?" She said, "How could I get into that kingdom, please?" I said, "Why do you want to get in?" She said, "It's time I got my life straightened out." And my heart leapt. I thought, hallelujah, I must be preaching the right gospel at last. Because when Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom, it was people like that that wanted to hear it. That's how you can tell if your pastor or vicar is preaching the right gospel. If he only attracts good people, he's not preaching the right gospel. Because the real gospel attracts bad people for the same reason as Jesus attracted lawbreakers, sinners. And we've got to ask why. I puzzled my head for a long time over why this should happen to such a teacher who both preached and practiced such a high standard of living. And I came to this conclusion, that bad people felt that if he was their friend, they could somehow live that way. That's the truth. I would guarantee that you've learned far more about holiness, not from books, but from having a holy friend. Maybe a grandparent, maybe a husband or wife, maybe just a very ordinary person who lived a holy life. And just knowing them made you feel better, right? And made you want to be better. Don't study books on holiness. Just develop a relationship with holy people. Above all with Jesus, who said, "I am the life." Now this begins to make him unique. You can study, there have been other great teachers, other great moral teachers, others who've taught a high standard of living, others who've achieved degrees of holiness and sanctity, but no one has ever quite achieved the level that Jesus achieved. And above all, no one has ever attracted sinners like he did and lifted them. Jesus did the very opposite of what the church seems to be doing in England today. The church seems to be saying, let's lower our standards to meet the people. Let's have divorce, let's have homosexual, let's have them all out of a sentimental attitude of love. And let's lower the standards of the church to meet the people where they are. Jesus did the exact opposite, and he had more compassion and love than we have. He said, I'm going to lift people until they reach my standard. I'm going to make it possible for them to live this way. I'm not going to bring the standards down to meet people, but I can bring people up to meet my standards. And he just had to have one lunch with a crooked financier. And that crooked financier not only said he would put all his books straight and get his finance in order, he said, I'm going to repay everybody I've defrauded. And Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house. All began because that man who was fiddling all his books cheating everybody, hated by everybody, became a friend of Jesus, or rather, Jesus became a friend of his. As nobody else in the whole of history has managed to do this as well as Jesus did it. It begins to make him special. Others have said you ought to live this way. Jesus said you can live this way if you know me, because I am the life. Well, we'll leave it there. And then I want to look in the next talk at what I would call his mysterious personality, what he said about himself. And that was really what raised the question, who does he think he is?